Well, there's certainly one thing that is absolutely clear about the energy transition is that mitigating global warming has to go hand in hand with continuing economic progress. And we don't have a choice if we're going to bring everyone along with us. You can view this as a huge challenge, or I prefer to see it as an enormous opportunity. It's creating for India, for the UAE, and of course the world. So to discuss this further, please welcome my next panel up to the stage. Please welcome them. We'll give them a round of applause, and I'll introduce them once they're up here. Thanks so much. We've got Anuka Dada, who is founder of Zeroism, former UK Prime Minister's senior advisor on energy. We also are delighted to have Mitika Bajpai, Senior Sustainability Manager at Reliance Industries. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks.
We've got Jitendra Roy Chowdhury, Research Fellow at CAPSARC. And we also, delighted to say, hot off the heels of parking his electric car?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Walid Sheta from Schneider Electric here in the UAE. So let's kick off. I'm going to ask you the same question and we'll build on it. I'd love to know, is the biggest concern that we hear about as we transition away from fossil fuels is that we're not actually moving fast enough. So how can we see this acceleration of the transition? How can we make it more of a business opportunity? Anuka.
All right, I'll kick off. So thank you for having us. What do I think on that question? Well, look, it's called fueling the future, but actually a lot of the technologies that we need, we already have and have had for a century, so solar, hydro. So actually, we're now seeing the cost of capital of these projects be as competitive as fossil fuel projects, if not cheaper. So it's now a deployment issue rather than a, can we do it? So I think what that actually means is let's get on. And actually, we're seeing with fossil fuel price volatility right now, I think that is going to continue. If you want a prediction from me, that would be it, which is actually we're now not going to do renewable projects out of the goodness of our heart, but actually because there is a real economic kind of incentive there.
Interesting. All right.
Absolutely. That's very interesting. So I think there's two aspects of fueling the future in this context, right? We're talking about what is the best possible use of fossils, whether it is in energy. If you have the alternative technologies that you need for the energy transition, what role does fossil fuel now play? And I would say the best possible utilization of that would be in the hydrogen value, or the hydrocarbons value chain, for petrochemicals, or for chemicals in general, right? Because the new materials economy is as important as the new energy economy. I think two of them go hand in hand.
Jitendra, how do we turn this into a business opportunity?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. And if I would look at it in terms of turning it into a business opportunity, we need to look at it from three aspects. So the first aspect is that for the energy transition to be successful, we need energy markets which are stable, accessible, and equitable. Which means that we need to continue to invest in fossil fuel supply so that the shocks that Anuka was talking about, they don't occur and they don't disrupt the transition. So that's number one. The second is that there has to be a greater collaboration and cooperation in terms of technology sharing or technology development between the countries so that no one gets left behind. And the third one is that we need to look at using policy frameworks like the circular carbon economy framework so that we can use the existing energy focused infrastructure and be able to repurpose it for energy resilient transition into the future.
Okay. Walid, what about you? How can we use this, how can we accelerate the transition by viewing it as a business opportunity?
Sure. So thank you for receiving me in this panel. And I would like to say that some of it was said before. Today, the renewable energy and energy efficiency is sustainable from an economical point of view by fact. And we can see that in many economies, not necessarily the industrialized ones, but also the new growing, fast-growing economies like Africa, for example, where we see a lot of partners, institutions, both public and private, investing into either a green or net zero microgrid, or on the other hand side, energy efficiency. And for that, we have very concrete examples. We have an entity called Alpha Structure that is established in the USA in a joint venture with Carlyle, and it's about economical empowerment of institution, public and private sector, to make the most of their energy and to reach the net zero. How they do that is by providing energy as a service, clean energy as a service, and it's a viable economical model. So we are not into a wishful thinking anymore. We are in fact into a business model that is thriving across the Atlantic, and we are definitely willing to bring it here, both to the Middle East, and it's already happening, by the way, in India.
Interesting. I want to get to specific fuels or specific ways we're going to be generating energy, but first let's take a look at the policy. And I'd love to hear from each of you one or two specific policies that could be needed either in India, the UAE, or pick your country that you might live in, to see the acceleration that we need in these green industries, electrification of mobility or decarbonization of electricity generation. Nuka.
So my former boss, Boris Johnson, used to have a phrase for this, and he would say, we're cakeist. And I think that has to be the approach for UAE and India and the world, which is actually we're going to need it all. So kind of let's develop. But if you made me pick, I would probably say actually, and I think Jatinder's going to come on to more of it, but CCUS, but actually the utilization point, I think, is a real bit that India and the UAE as a kind of nation of engineers and builders actually can really kind of get on and help us deliver.
Okay.
Completely stole my thunder.
I'll give you a moment to come up with another policy.
Right, so
What about you, Mitika?
Right, I think the two of them will certainly talk more about technology portion, so I won't touch on that. Technology is one major aspect of unity or alignment in this context, but also I think that is very closely linked with business opportunity and how we choose to report in a unified framework around it. I think once everyone's speaking the same language, everyone's aligned towards the same commitment, that makes a huge difference, instead of working in silos and following your own path.
So let me shamelessly steal both from Nuka and Mitika and say that if we can have a framework which allows countries to leverage their strengths in carbon sequestration and storage and develop products from that carbon which is being sequestered, then it becomes an easier sell for energy transition. Because it, as the word says, transition means that it's going to take a lot of time. So we need to be able to use the existing infrastructure which has already a sunk cost associated with it. And to use Mitika's point, I think this is where collaboration between countries will allow those countries which have access to greater renewable capacity to use the sequestered carbon from other countries which have lesser renewable capacity, so that it's much more of a collaborative effort rather than a competitive effort. I think we were listening to Dr. Jaishankar speak in the morning, and he was talking about the fact that there is less of a technology transfer regime and less of technology sharing. That is something which we have to counteract, and by cooperating on new developing technologies and sharing costs and reducing risk.
How do you think that's going to happen, though, in a moment when we seem to be retrenching and nationalism seems to be more prevalent than cooperation?
So the challenge then becomes how, what's the win in the counterparty. Right now everyone is looking at the technologies which are going to develop from the energy transition as one of a business opportunity. But if it is one where everyone gets a share of the pie, and it's not a small pie but a larger pie that everyone is able to address, then it becomes easier. I'll give you an example. If you break down $1 million into nickels and dimes, then it's easier for you to work with a larger group. Whereas if you have just one single block, then it becomes difficult. And the other aspect is that each and every country have their own competitive advantage. How you synergize them together so that each one is able to provide the aspects that they are best suited for, or they have the resources and the intellectual capacity or the research capacity to focus on, then it becomes easier for everyone to succeed rather than only one to succeed.
Interesting. Walid, what policy would you pick either for India or the UAE to accelerate green industry?
Yeah. Well, in fact, we used to rely on subsidies and encouragement in the past to make alternative sources of energy be more viable. But today, it's not the question, in fact. Today, the only fact to stop subsidizing fossil fuel in many of our geographies would be sufficient to make the alternative sources of energy viable. Now, to answer a previous question, you mentioned about what would make countries more eager to go toward these type of energies in a time of protectionism and risks that are overwhelming our planet. I would say that it can be a very good alternative to gas and oil to go for a different source of energy and a more efficient usage. So it can be also used as a protective mean toward the turbulences that could go on the level of the planet, to use either alternative renewable energies or to reduce the consumption of energy through energy efficiency. Again, we believe it can be done through technology and digitization.
Interesting. Let's talk about some of the actual fuels. We'll start with solar. We might start in the sunnier climes, so maybe in the Middle East and India, before we come to, frankly, in the UK, where I haven't seen the sun in several months. But
I'm assured it's there.
it's above the clouds. It's always there. But Jitendra, why don't you kick us off with where you think it's important? What's important to think about from your perspective in the world when we look at solar, and how best to accelerate its acceptance?
So if you're looking at solar, the first thing is that you need to be able to roll out it at scale. So if you're looking at rolling it out at scale, and that's where economies of scale kick in, so that you can get cheaper electricity, and then you can have derivatives from that solar. But the first aspect is that you need to be able to build scale. And to be able to build scale, you need to have industrial capacity, you need to have financing for that industrial capacity, and you need to be able to collaborate with countries on the entire supply chain, not just the critical minerals part, but also the technology part. This is something which is still being worked on. If you look at the recent events where the US has signed a supply chain agreement, they are focusing on trying to ensure that the supply chain is viable. These are things which are going to be invested on, and it will develop more and more. I'm sure that the Inflation Reduction Act will also provide a huge impetus to development of a viable supply chain. So, viable supply chain, security of supply, and stability of supply. Sorry, I always like three.
Mitika, I think, am I right in thinking that your Reliance is going to be responsible for 20% of India's 500 kilowatts by 2050?
Right, so India is committed to 500 gigawatts by 2030.
2030.
Right, which is nearly half of what India's energy requirements would be by 2030, which is a substantial amount. And I think it's part of the Panchamrit goal that the Prime Minister had announced last year. Reliance has committed to about 100 gigawatts to establish and enable 100 gigawatts by 2030. So yes, that is 1/5, and that's a substantial amount. And how we've talked about doing that is a couple points that he already touched on. It is we are trying to establish 2 gigafactories in the solar space, one for the photovoltaic ecosystem and to create that. But also we realize that just providing the PVs is not the solution. Just providing the technology per se is not technologies at scale. It is not going to solve the problem, because decentralized solar in India actually has been around since the 1960s and has been proven to be successful since the 1960s. The second important piece of the puzzle is the battery ecosystem. And I think this is where I think the IT infrastructure is also important, where we're not just talking about batteries, but an entire battery management system, right? So what is the IT enabling that battery ecosystem, and how that will enable the entire manufacturing ecosystem to adapt to it. So it's not just either or, it's of course making it affordable for everyone, but also ensuring that the transition is happening across the value chain, right?
Did you want to come in on
Music
on
to
that
my
one?
ears. Yeah, definitely. We often believe that just the source of energy would solve it all. And in reality, as it was very rightfully said, it's all about how do we manage that energy. For your information, 35% of the global emissions are coming from buildings, like this one. So if we could reduce the footprint of the consumption of buildings, aside of transportation, which is another huge one, it's already solving a big part of the equation. And we believe that there is a new trend of electricity 4.0 that makes electricity more distributed. So we don't generate in one place and then consume in another place. But we have the concept of prosumers that are doing both. The management of all of that, so digitization. And last would be decarbonization. And decarbonization, of course, but by obvious sources of energy that are other than the fuel ones. So yeah, for sure, the technology and the softwares and hardwares that would manage all of this transition are as important as the source of the energy itself.
Anuka, how do you view solar? And I wonder how we adapt our climate transition strategies to our local conditions and needs.
Yeah, so I think on the politics of it, generally, certainly in the UK, and I think this is replicated kind of internationally, and so it will resonate with a lot of people. Nationally, it tends to be polls well, right? People are like, yeah, great, this brings down prices, it's great, we're using a natural resource, but when it comes to actually building it, there's a bit of, I think they're called not in my backyard in the UK. And so it's that friction with where the national meets the kind of local. But look, my experience has also shown that it's not insurmountable. Actually, what you have to do is build a local strategy, building community benefits. So actually, how do we show people, not just tell them that they will kind of see a benefit to it? And actually, the politics are then,
Where have you seen that work? Give us an example.
So we're doing it in the UK, and actually it's partly why I left government, because I wanted to go and help get this stuff done on the ground, because there's only so much you can do at a national level. You actually need to then go and be doing more local strategies. And I actually think the harder bit of the solar piece is going to be the critical materials that we need for all of these. Certainly if you're building loads of them, what we kind of as a world will also need quite a lot of this material. And I think that's going to be a really interesting piece as we think about the energy system as a global piece, but we might be moving on to that now.
Yes, well, exactly. Well, why don't we have a look at green hydrogen? How important do you think green hydrogen will be?
The short answer is very. So when I was in the Prime Minister's office, I asked my team to build a systems map, and it was the first time we'd done this. And it actually put green hydrogen in the centre of a lot of it, which I found quite a revelatory exercise. Others might have been convinced earlier, but I was like, and I think it's important for a couple of reasons, but I'll let Jatinder do the second. Not least because actually it's a really useful chemical store, right? So as we build out more and more renewables, we actually can utilise, wind that we would otherwise curtail by turning it into this great thing that we can then use as fuel for other things. But I might let Jatinder do that one. Otherwise I'm stealing all his points. But my main one is you need to think about it as a system, and the systems map says it's really important.
Okay, so what else is it useful for, Jitendra?
Not just as a store of energy, but also it being able to reduce the carbon footprint of petchem feedstock used in direct as hydrogen fuel in IC engines, both in heavy-duty trucks and also as green ammonia in shipping. So the applications of green hydrogen are massive in those hard-to-abate sectors where it's difficult to electrify. And the second thing is that you would need to have diversity of sources of energy in the future energy mix. If you electrify everything, then you are reducing the resiliency of the system a lot. So if you have other fuel sources which are available and viable, then it increases the resiliency of the electricity grid.
You should be spoiled for choice.
Sorry?
You should be spoiled for choice.
Yes, exactly. You should be spoiled for choice, and it also provides you an opportunity to take advantage of situations. For instance, right now there's an electricity crisis in Europe, and Switzerland has said that you can't charge your EVs because it's going to put pressure on the grid. So if you have a hydrogen or a plug-in hybrid like you have, at least you have that option.
Yeah, well, exactly. What would you add, Walid?
Honestly, very few to what has been said. What is sure is that having the choice and alternatives to many energy sources is crucial, because as it was rightfully said, for example, solar energy can be very volatile and not stable if you overcharge it. So you have to have alternative like for example, why not green hydrogen? Again, I want to insist on the fact that it is happening as we speak today. The green hydrogen is being invested heavily in this part of the world, by the way, and among others by Indian investors, which correlates with what we were saying, to be an alternative to the traditional sources of fuel. And it is happening in Saudi, in the UAE, in Northern Africa. So there are many projects of green hydrogen coming in, and that is the proof that it has a business case that was studied and have proven to be successful. So.
Do you want to add from an Indian perspective?
Right. So I think with hydrogen, while technology is something everyone world over is exploring as to what is the right way to move forward with green hydrogen, or rather which technology is the most efficient way of doing it, I think the key piece of making it successful is the economics. I think to get the business case out of it and to get the price down to a competitive price such that we are spoiled for choice by the end of it is a very interesting take, and it's something that an aspiration that India has also announced, or our chairman had also mentioned last year at a climate summit, was the 111 ambition, right? To get the price of hydrogen, green hydrogen, down to $1 per kg by the end of this decade. If we can make that happen, I think the entire energy value chain will be drastically different by the end of this decade.
What needs to change in order to make that happen?
So with hydrogen, it's a very interdependent ecosystem. So it's not just it's not just your trucking system that will probably have to adapt to, make the generator changes, make your engine changes, and adapt to a hydrogen ecosystem. It is also the people that are supplying the hydrogen that will play a very important role in terms of making the supply safe operationally, and getting the manufacturing sorted as a technology piece. Getting the behavioral change to be able to adapt to the safety regulations is one aspect. But I think this is one industry where collaboration is seamless. Unlike all the other industries wherein first mover advantage
Why is that?
I think it's also because the technology is still being explored together. I'm hoping. I don't know whether that is the right answer. I'm hoping. We'll find out by the end of the decade.
Interesting. So I'd love to spend a moment on digitalization and how digital transformation will affect the energy sector and will increase accelerate the move towards green technology. Walid.
So definitely as I was saying, part of the solution comes from more monitoring, which means digitization of the assets and the consumption sources and motors or whatever elements that are consuming energy. The more we monitor, the more we cure. So digitization is only about being able to monitor the areas of consumption, balancing the loads, the demand versus the generation, and proposing the best alternative source or the best alternative usage of this energy. So digitization might seem like a wizard word, but in reality, it's all about measuring and then providing the better consumption advice and directly control in many cases. And what I like to take as example is, for example, JFK, the US, the New York airport, is now being managed by this convergence of IT and OT. And depending on the day, or depending on the load, or depending on the traffic, the artificial intelligence and machine learning will provide the electricity source and the consumption advice that would be the best for this time of the day, of the week, of the season, of the number of flights, and it correlates with big data. So at the end, when we say digitization, it's about monitoring, taking data, processing it, and usually real time providing an answer to the users. And it can be, of course, an airport, but it can be a factory. And even in many cases, and this might be a surprise, but even in the oil and gas industry, in refineries, you can still optimize and reduce through processes and specific softwares. You reduce the impact of the consumption of the fuel to produce the fuel. So even in the oil and gas industry, you can reduce the CO2 footprint.
I'm interested that you use JFK in the United States as your example, because it would have seemed to me that it's easier to do that kind of thing, to monitor and then switch supply in a place like the Middle East. Or you're saying that it's...
You are totally right. And here it's our duty as companies that are specialized in that to provide the answer, because the demand is here. And 2 years ago, when I was talking about sustainability to decision makers in the region, it was good to have. And we were in ADIPEC, all of us, a few weeks ago, and we saw that we are all now focusing on lower emissions with maximum energy, and this is now becoming a request from our customers, from the governments, and it's becoming even a mandate. So I would say that it's our duty to be more present in the Middle East to provide these answers. And I want here also to give a big salute to our colleagues in India who are doing a great job, because all what I am explaining here, they are providing it to hospitals, factories. We were in a learning expedition to Bangalore 1 month ago, where we have a lot of our R&Ds developed there. And guess what? Today R&D in Bangalore is a lot about software. It's a lot about artificial intelligence and algorithms. To do what? To provide better energy efficiency in most of the cases for us and for our partners.
I wonder, Mitika, do you want to come in on that issue around digital transformation, monitoring from your perspective?
Right, I think I don't think you can make any kind of transition happen without data at this point. I think the generation is changing. I think your aspirations are changing, and I think it was also discussed earlier today in terms of what comprises as data, who owns the data. What are you choosing to do with that data, right? And this is, I think this is where the collaboration piece comes in, wherein if you can, irrespective of where within the entire supply chain you fall, if you have a system or a portal or a data platform that helps you understand, okay, this is your piece of the puzzle, this is where you fall within the entire supply chain, you make the entire supply chain traceable using digital transformation tools, I think that'll solve a major chunk of the challenge. It's, I know, a very long way to go, and to be able to grapple with something. This is not just big data. This is like gigantic, humongous data. It's like a whole new level of data that we are talking about to be able to solve this issue. It's, but I think it's a very important piece of the puzzle. Digital transformation plays a key role. But I also think this is where you see startups, at least in the Indian ecosystem, creating a huge shift. Right? We saw disruptors. One of them is also a sponsor here, so I will not take the name, but we get the gist. You see disruptors like that in apps, right? And if using an app for something as simple as hailing a cab can be such a seamless transition, I think that is the amount of seamless transition we need to bring about in the energy transition, in the materials transition, and everything else that is required for the climate puzzle to be solved. I think digital transformation has a major role to play in there.
We've heard it, or I've heard it described, there's no silver bullet to solve climate change, but we do have silver buckshot, and one of those pieces of buckshot is, of course, nuclear. No discussion on fueling the future would be complete without discussing it. There's political considerations around it, certainly in the UK, elsewhere in Europe. But Anuka, where do you see this debate taking us in the next few years?
I think the debate on nuclear has really shifted actually over the last year, 18 months or so, where actually it's now becoming more accepted as part of that cakeist kind of mix. But I think for a couple of reasons, at the risk of sounding inconsistent, right? I keep on saying I'm pro-tech, and then I'm talking about technology that we've actually had for decades, if not, it's been around since the 60s, I think. So it's not exactly new when we're talking about large gigawatt-type reactors. Yes, they're really tricky to build, mainly because I bear the scars of getting one over the line and one not over the line.
Right.
Actually, these things take years before, political debate before you even then get into building them, which takes 10 years. But when you build them, they produce power, right? And the marginal cost of producing that power is actually pretty low compared to other things. So the benefit is there. It's, as we've discussed over the course of today, actually, it's often that kind of time horizon inconsistency that makes it a bit trickier. The really interesting debate will be around small modular reactors and, dare I say it, fusion, but certainly small modular reactors, where actually if you're bringing down the scale of that, you're bringing down the cost of it by something like a tenth to a tenth. So actually that kind of changes the debate and the build time. And some people are saying we'll have SMRs online as soon as kind of by the end of the decade, so probably when you've built your gigawatt of solar. So I'd say kind of let's just get behind that and try and actually make it work.
Jitendra, what would you add?
I would only say that just to add to Anika's point about the nuclear power plants taking a long time, it happens primarily because you don't build it in scale. If you build it in scale, then you get again the advantages of economies of scale. You have a manufacturing line which is able to replicate it. So if you approach nuclear power plants from a cluster approach, then it's a great investment. It does take time, but the benefits that you get in terms of stable baseload power, long-term cheap power, and being able to provide a base to intermittency from renewables, which could be balanced with hydrogen or gas or other aspects. Those are huge positives for nuclear. So I would say that, nuclear has a huge role to play. You can see it in the UAE, you can see it in India. Both are building power plants.
Fascinating. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists. We've run out of time. They've pulled the plug on us, so to speak. But we'll be staying with this conversation for the rest of the next few days. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.